Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Terminal Philosophy for episode 15 of our History of Warfare series. And we're now talking about the campaigns of Philip II. Now, generally, Philip II is often overlooked in the face of the career of his illustrious son, Alexander the Great. But in a lot of ways, Philip should be better known in his own right, not only because of his military reforms, which we covered last episode, but also due to his campaigns. So, setting the stage for Philip, there's really two strategic considerations governing Philip's career. One is the preservation of the Macedonian state from complete destruction, and then two is preparation for the invasion of Persia, which will also explain a lot of his relatively lenient treatment of the Greeks, as we'll get to in a moment. But when Philip comes to power, the king of Macedon, Perdiccas, had just been killed and his army annihilated in a battle against the Illyrian king Bardalus. And Bardalus had taken much of northwestern Macedonia under his control. And also the Thracians are getting a little itchy and ready to make a move. And so Philip starts bribing a lot of people. He marries the daughter of Bardalus, and he then tries to root out pretenders to the throne, usually solving that problem by assassinating them. And also training his new army. So by 358 BC, he's got rid of the pretenders. He's trained enough of a new army to actually use it in battle. And at the Battle of Aragon Valley, he crushes the Illyrian army. The Illyrians have about 10,000 infantry, 500 horse. Philip has around 10,000 infantry and 600 horse. And while, as with a lot of the battles of Philip, there aren't a lot of details, it's pretty clear that the deciding advantage was his cavalry, which would be his new reformed companion cavalry, as well as his hypaspists, who were able to crush the left of the Illyrians. And then he was able to regain the lost territories to the north. At that point, he now has to deal with the Athenian presence. There were a series of Athenian allied or Athenian colonies near Macedonia, Amphipolis, Pydna, Potidaea, among others. And he needs to start getting rid of that influence and pressure. So he begins with Amphipolis, which is also bordering Thessaly. Amphipolis is important because, well, for at least three reasons. From the Peloponnesian War, it was the victory at Amphipolis by Lysander, which allowed the Spartans to have a chokehold on the Athenian grain supplies and bring the war to a speedy end. Athens, of course, is concerned about this, as always, but it also has silver and gold mines, which could fund Philip's campaign. And so, basically, Philip takes the move to take Amphipolis, and then he moves to take Pydna and Potidaea. And in order to get the Athenians off his back, he says, look, you give me Pydna, and I'll give you Amphipolis back. But he had no intention of actually giving Amphipolis back. This is where people like Demosthenes get their ammunition for Philip as two-faced. He'll say one thing to one group of people and then do a completely different thing in another group of people. And we see also with Amphipolis, this is the first instance where Philip's sort of new reformed siege train is able to be used decisively to take a city. Whereas, in previous Greek warfare, sieges like this could last for years and years and years and be relatively indecisive. So Philip decisively takes it. And then in order to take Potidaea and Pydna, he allies with the chief city of the Chalcidican League, Olynithus, which he will eventually turn on about a decade later. And that's what Philip tends to do. Philip has this 1-2 punch strategy of allying with one group against another. And then once his objectives have been achieved, he then flips sides and destroys his former ally. And again, this sort of two-facedness about Philip is what earns him a lot of his bad press in the Greeks. So, having set up the strategic position of Macedon and Philip's early campaigns to stop the hemorrhaging, what are some of your thoughts?
Right. Well, in our previous video, I think we did a decent job of analyzing the internal and structural reforms of Philip's army, specifically with new weapons and formations, various breakthroughs in siege equipment, more intensive and refined training for various troops, as well as a more robust logistical system for the army at large. I think you gave a good introduction as to what Philip had to contend with militarily and politically, and without getting lost in the various details of assassinations and political instabilities that led to Philip's rise to power. I will say just briefly that looking at Macedonia at this particular moment in history, one should take a moment to reflect on the sort of initial immense pressure that any general or ruler would likely have to shoulder here. I mean, you lost several thousand men in cavalry not long before Philip's claim to the throne. Some of his best men were lost just simply due to bad or outdated tactics. Again, this is pre-reform, so and then also there wasn't a very stable situation at their capital with assassinations and just a general atmosphere of distrust and paranoia among their elites. And again, there's almost threats in every direction. I mean, even with Thrace and the Dardanians sort of flip flopping between going to war and agreeing to brief peace treaties. So there's quite a lot going on there. Um, so again, Philip, although luckily inheriting troops with an equestrian tradition as well as some regional allies to lean on, he was off to a bad start in the realm of warfare. Uh, with that being said, though, I think it's relevant as you started. I think we're with the initial victories with Illyria and oh, sorry, I forget the
Amphipolis.
pronunciation. Amphipolis. Thank you. These Greek names are kind of killing me lately, but yeah, you were right to mention its sort of previous sort of Greek economic legacy with grain holdings, and this is also the location for a lot of silver and gold for Athens historically. Um, and then, of course, they have the seizing of Potidaea, which during the Persian Wars and as well as the Peloponnesian War, this was as a fairly well-established naval base for Athens. Um, it was sort of, as far as I could tell, it was hard to get some clear information on this, but I think it was one of their most northernmost naval outposts as far as doing conducting like naval warfare in the Aegean. So Potidaea was a pretty inconvenient loss for Athens. Um, as you had mentioned too, there was quite Philip's funny because he really does kind of know when to pick his battles, and there's a lot of almost complicated and dramatic relationships with other tribes and allies because he will after for example I'll get to in just a second with the Aragon Valley between the Dardanians, but after that had happened, after the Battle of Aragon Valley, he Athens was willing for a time to be to declare a peace treaty, and after he had taken after Aragon Valley, they had they meaning Athens had agreed to give Philip a city to the south that was near Olympus, and I think it was forgive me, but it starts with a oh, I found it. Sorry. So it's a Pydna, Pydna, and but he went back on his word, and we'll see that a few more times coming up here in the future. But kind of saying one thing and doing another, just to sort of consolidate Macedonia's power. But so with all that being said, as well as again Philip, having the benefit of having a lot of cavalrymen, or at least a tradition of cavalrymen in his area. I think it's relevant to at least analyze or the Dardanians to the north and the northwest. Now, as we've discussed, the Athenians regarded many of the people north of them to be, less refined and less civilized, and which, taking that with a grain of salt in terms of Athenian elitism, or perhaps an Athenian inflated sense of self, they probably weren't too far off the mark. With this stage, this stage of population and number of settlements in the Hellenic world, Macedonia became a regional power of its own. It was behind places like Athens and Anatolia, but not too far behind. Now, however, north of Macedonia, with the Dardanians, are people who were more on the, probably in line with, closer to the barbarians that Athens thought Macedonia was. And it's not probably too far to say that the Dardanians were probably something like half a century to a century behind the rest of the Greek city-states, just in terms of civilizational development. Now, by 358, it's fair to say that Philip's army was back in fighting order. These reforms were implemented, and a lot of the men were trained up, and many of the Macedonians were basically recategorized socially, and so that they were able to fill out some of these needed ranks in Philip's army. Now, again, with trading on and off between all-out war and sort of these brief peace treaties with the Dardanians initially wanted, they could see some of Philip's progress, some of this momentum that he had gained, and they wanted to declare a peace treaty, but ultimately Philip did not agree to that, and this is what would come to be known as the Battle of Aragon Valley. Now, again, as you mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of details with most of these battles, but what there is enough evidence for is this sort of this formation of what we discussed in our previous video, of this right flank of the Macedonian army being sort of loaded with not only the heavier and more elite infantry, but also the companion cavalry. And they are more or less what is loosely agreed upon to have won him the battle. The Dardanians ended up losing most of their army, again, as far as the best sources can detail, and the Macedonians only lost about 100. Well, about 100 to about 300 or 400 is kind of the best range that's given. But I think again, this is all due to just his reforms and the use of companion cavalry that ends up being sort of this asset on the right flank of the Macedonian army.
Exactly. The next real issue or struggle that Philip has to go up against is the continued thorn in his side of Athens. Now, one of the things that you'll see Athens do a lot in this is organize resistance to Philip, but not really commit. And it's this lack of committal, I think, on Athens' part that renders a lot of these anti-Philippic leagues so weak. So, for example, in his campaign against Amphipolis and Pydna, Athens says, "Yeah, we're going to help," but then they wait for the Estian winds to come, and the weather's too bad. We'll wait, and then of course everything is taken before they can even do anything, and it's not clear if this waiting is due to the debate within Athens, because there was a pro-Philip party led by Socrates, who was a pan-Hellenist, and there was an anti-Philip party led by Demosthenes. And it could very well be that these pro-anti-Philip parties were what explains the desultory response of Athens to Philip. But this newer alliance will fail for the same reason. One of the things that we see is Athens sort of it gets the kings of Thrace and even some more Illyrians to join in an attack on Philip. Now, they still have a few more holdings in the region: Crinides, Maronia, and Abdaria, and Methone. And so Philip has to then defeat the Thracians and the Athenians again. Now, there's, again, not a whole lot written on these campaigns. There is some disagreement. Diodorus Siculus seems to think that Philip rapidly marched out and defeated them before they could even mobilize, or forced them to sign a peace treaty before they could fully mobilize, which would be in line with the sort of more rapid operational and strategic mindset of the Macedonian army. They could just march so fast, people don't even know they're coming. But some people argue that the campaign was more Philip defeats them one at a time in detail over many years. And they'll cite Plutarch, who mentions in his biography of Alexander the Great that Parmenion defeated the Illyrian king Grabos in 356 BC. Whether he did it in a sort of swift blitzkrieg all at once or defeating them sequentially, it's not really clear. But the improved Macedonian army was more than a match for these forces, and the remaining Athenian cities fell relatively quickly due to the improved siege machinery of Philip. The one city that I think deserves some mention is Crenades, which is also another gold mine area. So with Amphipolis and Credenes, Philip now has a large reserve of gold to fund his military campaigns, to cement alliances, to bribe people. It really helps set up the economic base of Macedon. And these neighboring kingdoms, the alliance with the Chalcidican League under Olynythus, and his destruction of the Athenian cities or recapture of them, so that Athens is completely expelled from this northern region of Greece. And these kingdoms are replaced by friendly vassal states or friendly allied states. Sort of solves Philip's first strategic problem. Macedon is now no longer under threat of being destroyed. Its enemies on its borders have been defeated and pacified. Athens, which was continually stirring up trouble, has been expelled from the region. And furthermore, it gives him the upper hand in any dealings with Athens, because now he has unchecked control of the grain shipments coming from what is today the Ukraine, which had fed Athens since time out of mind. And so at this point, Philip's first strategic goal is essentially accomplished.
Right, exactly. And, again, I think, one thing I think it's fair to say that a common misconception with Philip is that he was sometimes nothing but a conqueror. But I think that this is only about half of the story. With Philip, with these successful seizures of a lot of these gold and silver mines, as well as kind of, saying one thing and doing another, and also leaning on allies at precisely the right times. I think for his time, with the standards of the time in mind, he knew how to play the game of politics, as well as excel very well in warfare. Again, when you look at sort of the participants in the Third Sacred War, for example, I mean, again, either through bribing or through, because Philip was at least good on his threats as well, whereas I think Athens was definitely not. You have Thebes and the Boeotian League and Thessaly and Locris and Doris and of course Macedon. However, at this point, in the 350s and 340s, a lot of these city-states, I think people need to be reminded, were just basically kind of worn down, just from either economic or just exhaustion from war. Again, this is, as Sparta is sort of long past sort of its glory days, with being the most dominant army on the ground. Only some of the other side of the Third Sacred War, you have Athens and Phocis and Sparta and Pharia, and again they are just not able to. Again, they don't have two things. They don't have the money that they had in the past, in the days with the Spartan and Theban hegemony, and then also they don't have this robust sort of revamped military or army like Philip does. And so Yeah, Philip just had all sorts of. Again, he knew how to play the political game of bribery and leaning on good allies as well. I mean, for one, he has a lot to thank for Thessaly for high quality companion cavalrymen, because that's a lot of them did come from the Thessaly area as well as Thebes.
Exactly. One other point that needs to be mentioned is, as far as Philip solving his first strategic problem, is Macedon, unlike its enemies, had the advantage of interior lines of communication, which means that between any 2 points Philip wants to go to, he has a shorter distance to travel than his opponents. And by skillfully playing upon interior lines of communication, with in part the increased rate of march of the Macedonian army, he could parry each blow and deal knockout blows before the enemy forces could properly present themselves. And now we see Philip shifting towards his second goal, his second strategic goal, preparing Greece for the invasion of Persia. And it seems that Philip II seems to have been of the same mind as Shakespeare's Henry V, when cruelty and lenity play for a kingdom, the gentlest gamester is the soonest winner, which explains why Philip was often so surprisingly lenient, especially to Athens, which had been a persistent thorn in his side. Without getting into the details of how the Sacred War started, basically Thebes, which was the head of the Amphictyonic League, a sort of quasi-political religious conference, if you will, of the Greek city-states, passed a fine on Phocas for farming the land that was dedicated to the Oracle at Delphi. And one of the things about the Phocians during this is they're sort of like outlaws at this point. They're sort of seen as like, worse than the Persians because they've, desecrated the gods and everything. But what they then do is they just loot the temple and pay mercenaries to fight for them. And so they're able to keep this war going by looting the temple, which of course makes them look even worse. So when Philip decides to get involved in this whole affair, he decides to take the side that has the moral high ground in the mind of Hellas. He can't very well take the Phocian side because he would be seen as, impious towards the gods if he did that. And so at this point, the Phocian ruler, let's see, these Greek names, like you said, are killing us. Onomarchus is leading an invasion into Thessaly to help the tyrant of Pherae, his ally, in order to, some people think, to completely not annex, but put a friendly power on the throne of Thessaly to then leverage that in his war against the Theban Boeotians. Now, Philip takes the side of the Thessalian League and decides to intervene. Now, in this first intervention, he's actually not successful. He is defeated by Onomarchus, and it seems to me that Onomarchus ambushed him in a mountain pass file and using tension-powered catapults just wrecked the Macedonian army. And in part, it was this lesson in defeat that helped him inspire the development of the torsion catapults. Now, Philip withdraws and then says, he says, I didn't run away. I'm going to come back like a ram and butt even harder. And one of the things that he does is he does come back. And he seems to have learned his lesson. And the first thing that he does is he takes the coastal city of Pagasae, which has the only really good port in the region, in Athens, which again is a perennial threat of his, and I'm pretty sure an ally of the tyrant of Pherae, cannot really deploy troops directly to Thessaly at this point because the only good port's taken. So he sort of guarded his flank that way. And he then takes on Onomarchus at the Battle of Crocus Field. Again, there isn't a lot written about it. Three things I think are important. One, Philip chooses his ground to take advantage of his cavalry. It's flat and not a mountain defile. Two, he sort of casts himself as the defender of the gods. I'm gonna punish these oath breakers. And then thirdly, it would appear again that his cavalry were the decisive element in the defeat of Onomarchus. And consolidating his gains there, the Thessalians elect him archon, which is a lifetime position. And then basically what he does to mop up the rest of Thessaly is he kind of plays this divide and conquer rule. Well, he'll put pressure on one city to then join him and then attack another city. And then he's like, oh, well, you were my ally last time, but not anymore. And I'll take you out. And through this combination of divide and conquer and posturing himself as the leader of the Thessalian League, which gives him a sense of legitimacy, and the defender of the piety of the gods, he sort of has this untouchable moral position, which allows him to lean on these cities until he's finally able to consolidate and virtually annex Thessaly. What sort of prevents him from moving any further is that Athens, Sparta, and Phocis have garrisoned Thermopylae Pass. And not wishing to repeat the mistakes of Xerxes, he decides to withdraw. And at this point, we see Philip has through skillful use of diplomacy, skillful use of the Hellenic religion, skillful use of military tactics, this whole unified package or suite of skills, has, on the relative cheap, almost doubled the size of Macedon and brought in the elite Thessalian cavalry.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And again, all these forces, well, I guess all these factors that have sort of coalesced up to the Battle of the Crocus Fields, and also to the west in I think it's Molossia, he had sort of leaned on them as well, and there was several Macedonian garrisons set up at Ambracia, as well as Corfu and Dodona, where again Athens, like older Athenian territory or at least allied territory, sort of being encroached on and becoming more under the influence of Philip. And then what you have here, of course, is as you mentioned before, this Athenian and sort of Spartan sort of confederation was able to hold off Philip for a time at the Thermopylae Pass, but this is sort of spelling the end for, or it's at this point it's just looking really bad for what at this point is just basically the League of Corinth, where you've got just declining influence. And as you mentioned before, he's also leaning well on the Hellenic religion, placing himself in sort of this PR sort of way where he's placed himself as defender of the gods in various battles. This is also present at the Battle of Philippi in Thrace. So yeah, he kind of knows how to play the game of being not only a great general, but being a good, good in quotes, of course, but being a competent military commander, and also I guess you could just say a skilled politician for the time.
Exactly. Now, again, Athens is trying to put pressure back up near and around Macedon. So a few things, a new coalition has developed. So the Thracian city of Carabelleptes turns against Philip. The Athenians, under the general Chares, capture Sestos, which is on the Thracian Chersonese, or today's Gallipoli Peninsula, which again is a strategic line for grain shipments from the Ukraine to Athens. And furthermore, Olenithus seems to also have turned against Philip. So Philip is once again facing a coalition led by Athens. He marches directly on Carabelleptes and essentially captures hostages and forces them to essentially tap out of the fight so that they don't have to lose those, so those hostages won't be killed. During one of the sieges, Athens mistakenly believes that Philip was killed. So they delay direct intervention yet again, which of course means that they lose their positions yet again. And Philip marches south to finally finish off Olynythus and directly consolidate the Chalcidicean League. And again, Philip's proficient siege train brings city after city down. Olynythus fights Philip in 2 battles where it's defeated. Philip takes the city and has pretty much sewed up all the issues in the north. And Athens is, yet again, due to its own withering, been unable to put sufficient pressure on Philip.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is sort of getting to, I think it's fair to say that this is sort of culminating in the decisive Macedonian victory at Karenia, where again you've got Athens unable to sort of garner its former strength, both militarily and politically, as well. There's no longer this sort of this broad Athenian financial empire that it once sort of held itself to, and now you've got sort of a robust and recharged, not purely Macedonian army, but a Macedonian army that is joined by various allies that have come to heal under Philip with talented cavalry. Again, the companion cavalry are basically, you could argue, well, it's probably a toss-up. The MVP for Philip is probably a toss-up between the refined phalanx formation or the companion cavalry. But I mean, again, it's unfortunate that the details are so lacking with a lot of these battles, but with all of this culminating with the Battle of Karenia, you basically have something where Athens and Thebes and Corinth lose something like anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 men. And again, there's some information to suggest that cavalry was doing most of the work, but again, it's difficult to put all your chips on some of these contemporaneous sources. Again, when you study, when Herodotus often reports numbers, for example, sometimes these numbers are, they feel mythical, but I think Battle of Karenia was sort of the beginning of the end for Athens' sort of broad foreign influence in terms of the Aegean and Hellenic world goes. And now you're starting to see this consolidated Macedon take control of some of these difficult neighbors to the south. And again, at this point, also Sparta is basically grinded down to only a bit of territory at the southern peninsula and has occupied parts of Crete, but also Sparta could not really be leaned on militarily in terms of Athens' strategic situation.
Exactly. The Third Sacred War eventually ends in part because the Phocian alliance was not stable. One of the weaknesses of Phocas was that its leaders either were constantly killed in battle or overthrown by rival generals. And one rival general comes to power in 346, Phalakios, and he tells the Athenians and Spartans to scram. And of course, that's not enough troops to hold the pass against Philip, and Athens realizes, well, we can't really do anything about that now, can we? And so Athens makes peace. Philip, meanwhile, mops up in Thrace, taking out Chersobeleptes, but again, treating them relatively leniently, making them a subject ally. And then the ultimate settlement of the Sacred War, again, further cements Macedonian power. Philip is given a seat on the Amphictyonic Council. So this is like unprecedented. De facto barbarian is now put on par with the other Greek city-states. Phocas is more or less allowed to keep its original territory from before the war and is let off relatively leniently. And basically Philip's goal here is to keep the status quo because he doesn't want Greece devastated. He doesn't want Greece too weakened because he hopes that he can use these troops in his war against Persia. And so by the end of the Third Sacred War, Philip has not entirely, but nearly achieved his goals of unifying Greece and his second strategic goal of preparing the war against Persia.
Right. Yep. And in some of these, it's interesting because in previous campaigns and in previous wars, you have a lot of generals, basically leveling settlements and almost starting from scratch. Whereas Philip kind of knows when to. I think Philip knows well when to pick his battles in terms of when to decimate an enemy, or knows when an enemy is broken and can from there force an alliance on them. Now, perhaps I'm jumping the gun here just a bit, but I know with the Battle of Neon, now this involved Pamenes as well as the Amphictyonic force that was trying to cross into Phocis. However, this is where the I'm trying to think. It was either Philip's. This was mostly between Philip's allies versus sort of the Thracians to the northeast. But I had a difficult time finding any details on that, as it was sort of this was kind of more of an obscure battle. It's mentioned a lot, but there was sort of even less details with that than there were with places like the Battle of the Crocus Fields and some of these others like Karenia and so on and so forth. But now, at this point, we've kind of sort of set the stage for Philip getting ready to sort of bring war to the Persians in Anatolia. Now, he had somewhat of a I guess you could say that the precariousness of the Macedonians was in the sense that sometimes his willingness to go into battle too soon kind of cost him. Again, this is what really ended up happening at Byzantium. But overall, you've got and what you mentioned too, he becomes the Archon. He's also got a seat on the council. He's really got basically everything he needs. But of course, he's just before he's about ready to make war with the Persians, he's basically assassinated by the captain of his own bodyguard. But however, I don't know if I'm jumping the gun here, though.
Yeah, there's a good deal more that Philip does. Philip campaigns more in Illyria. He puts a friendly client king on the Molossian throne. He campaigns again in Thrace, but these are relatively minor. The final showdown that brings Philip all that he wants is the Fourth Sacred War and the war with Thebes and Athens. And if we look at, again, the Fourth Sacred War, there's really two factors to it. One, it's Athens again stirring up trouble, trying to support Byzantium. And this is actually one of the few times Philip fails to take a fortified city. And at this point, there's also disputes over cultivation of land to Apollo. In this instance, the citizens of Amphissa. Now, one of the things that pays off for Philip is he's able to set up a base in Phocian territory from which to directly strike out at Thebes and Athens. And his lenient treatment of the Thebans, of the Phocians rather, comes to pass here. It really helps him out a lot. And the other thing too, on this campaign, he brings his son Alexander the Great. And what we see is that Athens and Thebes mobilize. Philip, again, would rather find some sort of diplomatic solution, but again, at this point, Demosthenes has really stirred up the Greeks against Philip. And they're going to fight. And now we have the decisive Battle of Karenia, which is also the battle where Alexander the Great makes his debut. So from the Greek position, on their far left, we have the Athenians. There's the center is some Athenians and other Greek city-states, and on the right, the position of dominance of the Thebans. And the Thebans have their famous sacred band, which we've already mentioned. Philip is on the right with the Hypaspists and some of his phalangites. The center is primarily phalanx, and Alexander is on the far left with his companion cavalry. And what's interesting about the Battle of Karenia is Philip's troops were so well trained that when they pressed the Athenian left, they engaged in a feigned retreat, which normally, if done under conditions where the troops aren't well trained enough, can lead to the rout of your own forces. So it does show a level of control and discipline and training that these men had. They were probably veterans of Philip. They were referred to as his picked men. And again, unfortunately, like so many of these battles, there isn't a lot on Karenia. But what seems to be the decisive moment is this feigned retreat where the Athenians pursue, which opens a gap in the Greek center, which allows Alexander to exploit with his companion cavalry, and with the rest of the Macedonian left bearing down with their sarissas on the Greeks. Alexander essentially just rolls up the Greek line and encircles and decimates the sacred band. And they were the troops that fought to the very end. And of course, Philip erects a monument to their honor after the battle. But after he defeats Thebes and Athens, we have the foundation of the Corinthian League. He pressures Sparta, and he says, if I come down to invade you, then you'll be defeated. And Sparta responds in one word, if. But he doesn't really care about Sparta. And I think the reason why he doesn't care about Sparta really tells you how far Sparta has fallen. Sparta is not the city-state that it once was. Athens is really calling the shots on the Greek side throughout the last 10 years we've been discussing. Sparta has been relatively unimportant. And with the creation of the Corinthian League, it's sort of the culmination of Pan-Hellenism. So it's not like Philip is acting against all of Greek thinking or all of the Greek city-states. On the one hand, you do have the anti-Macedonian party of Demosthenes, but the Pan-Hellenists of Isocrates also are supportive of Philip. And Philip sort of sells this as a way that, you Greeks will finally be united now, and we can finally get to the real business of liberating the Greeks from the Persians. And these city-states are theoretically equals with each other and equal with Macedon, but really Macedon is the first among equals and the real overlord or hegemon of the region. But again, Philip needs this as a sort of political and moral veneer for his rule. He's very astute at needing to be have the moral high ground as well as the military high ground. And one of the reasons why he was so successful is because he was able to do this. And by the time he is killed by his bodyguard, which alternatively could have been the result of a love affair gone wrong, Alexander wanting to off dad, or maybe even the Persians trying to preempt a invasion of their own kingdom. What was left to Alexander the Great was essentially a pacified, united Greece with a well-drilled, well-organized veteran military force. The only campaigns of Philip that were largely ineffectual were the preliminary expeditions to Asia Minor led by Parmenion, where he was defeated by the Greek mercenary general Memnon of Rhodes. But other than that minor defeat, which we probably wouldn't even remember if Philip had lived and pushed the Persians back, we see that by the time of his death, his two strategic goals were achieved. Macedon's existence was protected by vassal states and buffer states around his kingdom, and Greece was more or less united in a common cause to liberate the Greeks. And so, again, when Alexander comes to the throne, everything is more or less in place for his later campaigns.
Yeah, you definitely nailed it. I think, it was interesting with the Battle of Karenia. there is, once again, with this sort of frustrating lack of details. However, there is some writings from Paulinus where there is some sort of a tentative claim you could probably make as a modern day historian that Alexander had control of the companion cavalry, while Philip and his forces on the right flank did sort of this feigned retreat. Again, as you mentioned, with Philip's handpicked men. I was trying to find whether or not this was enough evidence for something like a hammer and anvil tactic. However, it's hard to say because from the Athenian perspective of things, the Athenians were fighting Philip on their left flank, and it would appear that Alexander was fighting the Thebans and sort of other, the rough confederation of other forces from Megara and Achaia and so on and so forth. But it proved, it's tough to say if that was a hammer and anvil tactic that was properly executed or not, or if it was just more of Alexander just closing in on the right flank of the Athenians. But however, yes, you're correct with the formation of the League of Corinth, and what you had mentioned as well too, that this had set up Alexander to become perhaps one of the greatest conquerors of antiquity. You basically had not only a secured Macedon, but you had a sort of a well-trained and fine-tuned Macedonian and broader Macedonian coalition ready to go to war with the Persians. And with all of this, with all these various infighting within Greeks and the development of siege warfare and these torsion catapults, what you see is like a lot of innovation and a lot of thinking going on about how to make warfare more efficient, and as well as the development of Philip's logistical systems and more troops dedicated to just messaging, and the speed of things of warfare was becoming a lot more refined and quicker and more robust. And whereas it's difficult to say if much of any of that was going on within the Persian Empire, I think there's almost this sort of quasi-Soviet attitude towards raising an army, just sort of forced conscription. You've got the multi-cultured, multilingual issue of trying to have a disciplined army with potentially different cultures and languages at play within their ranks. So that would make managing an army difficult. But by and large, you have united culturally and linguistically, and really just a more up-to-date army ready to go to war in Anatolia. And of course, we'll see that with Alexander. But it's fair to say that without these reforms, without sort of knowing when to pick his battles and when to form alliances, there would have been no legacy of Alexander to speak of had his father not done all this sort of robust politicking like he had.
Exactly, and I think to sort of summarize the sort of strategic position of Macedon and Philip and his strategy and technique, Philip understood the strategic issues at play, right? Athens was his main threat within Greece as an impediment to the unification of Greece, and he understood that he needed to be able to put pressure on Athens in an analogous way that Lysander did by controlling access to the grain shipments of the Ukraine, or what was then known as Scythia. And so we see that he rather effectively does do that. And arguably that pressure is why Athens keeps on attempting to stir up trouble, because they know that if Philip can consolidate this position, that they just have no hope. They just have to accept the inevitable and move on. We see that he uses interior lines of communications very effectively in order to parry blows and attack enemy forces. Again, he seems to be of the Henry V school, playing the leniency card, which time and again paid off for him, even though he might have to fight the same opponent multiple times. For example, Athens, for example, some of the Thracian kings. But in the long run, it achieved the strategic goals that he wanted. And he correctly identified, from the point of view of a war against Persia, that Greek division was what kept Persia strong and safe, beginning with the Peloponnesian War and then later the Corinthian War and then other conflicts. Persia was always stirring up trouble by bribing one city-state to fight the other. And Philip just had to stop that. He just had to end it. And then coupled with his tactical reforms, his operational reforms, his army could march very rapidly, faster than most of his opponents could even mobilize. He'd be on the doorstep before they even knew he'd left Pella. And then with his development of siege warfare, he could the crucial fortified cities along the Aegean coast that were Athenian naval bases, he could never have taken under the earlier iteration of Greek siege tactics, which were none, basically. So he was able to radically innovate in siege warfare, which ultimately the application of torsion power catapults would be more under the rule of Alexander because Philip dies. But even the use of the tension catapults inherited from Syracuse, he very effectively takes these fortified cities. And Philip has this diplomatic sense where he plays the good guy, even when he's lying to your face, right? He might be lying to your face, but he plays the good guy, and it works. You know, he's going to defend Apollo. He's going to honor the gods, right? He's going to punish the oath breakers, or he's going to have the technical legality. He's technically correct because he represents the lawful authority of the Thessalian League or the Amphictyonic League, or ultimately the League of Corinth. And so Philip had this unique blend of diplomatic skill, military skill, negotiations, just the idea that you don't have a scorched earth policy. He understood that you had to not only keep the Greeks intact and not, eliminate them as a force completely, since he wanted to recruit them for his force, but also keep them on friendly terms and end the infighting that had left Greece weak for so many centuries. And yeah, he really, it is unfortunate that his son has so outshined him due to his own military accomplishments. That's not to say that Philip is equal to or greater than Alexander. That's really not right now the point for that argument. But nonetheless, he was, in any other age, he would be considered one of the great captains and statesmen.
Yeah, absolutely. When you sort of take this broad sort of overview of all of Philip's accomplishments, it makes you wonder why, again, due to all the wars that had happened before, it sort of makes you wonder, in sort of an alternate universe, had Sparta developed or had been A, less culturally and politically rigid, and B, had sort of developed an affinity for to not only maintain their reputation but also push things a bit further, because a lot of the times with Sparta, around Corinth, in fighting Athens, the mere presence of a wall or unfavorable terrain to cavalry would bring a Spartan campaign not necessarily to its knees, but it would just bring the pace of things to a halt. And so with Philip, the development of siege weaponry and siege towers. Again, this is more something that became popularized under his son, but at least he got it going. I mean, it makes you wonder why Athens or Sparta couldn't get a leg up on these developments before these, so-called barbarians from the north. Now, again, that's kind of a tongue-in-cheek Athenian sort of elitist viewpoint of. They even said that of the Thessalians, but you can imagine how that would have been extended to the Macedonians and the Dardanians. But I think when you get sort of an inflated sense of self and you think that things are fine, there's really no need for innovation. But someone like Philip, who was in this situation where he started off completely surrounded, and the army was in a pretty bad way. That actually forces a complete revamping of things, and reassessing tactics and strategy and weapons used, and also the innovation of siegecraft. So yeah, it's surprising that you wouldn't see that from a well-established, already historically established force or a city-state within Greece, but Philip was the one who ended up taking advantage of this need for advancements in warfare, as well as knowing when to negotiate, and when to knowing when to use diplomacy well enough. Even though a lot of the times he would tell Athens, okay, yeah, I'll give you this city if you don't send any more naval forces, and then he goes back on his word. So there was plenty of that. That was sort of, I think, fairly common for the time, though. And also the rise to Philip's power in Macedonia was preceded by a whole string of assassinations. So with all of the norms of the time in mind, as well as sort of the military traditions, I think Philip gave he gave the Hellenic world, militarily at least, a bit of a quantum leap, and that's where, of course, his son takes over.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks again, Terminal Philosophy.
Yeah, thanks for always having me, man.
Yeah, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.